Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio on KPFK Los Angeles and KPFT Houston, a project of SoCal 350 Climate Action. Our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. EcoJustice Radio acknowledges that we record the show on the traditional territory of the Tongva and all of their relatives. Welcome. I am Jessica Aldridge. On today's show, Soulful to Soilful, Cultivating Community Through Urban Composting, I will be interviewing Michael Martinez, founder and executive director for LA Compost. Michael is a former elementary school teacher, a father of two, and the founder and executive director of LA Compost. Michael has grown LA Compost from a group of volunteers collecting organics using bikes to a decentralized network of community compost hubs that span the most populated county in the country. LA Compost now oversees more than 40 compost hubs, all in partnership with existing communities, nonprofits, and organizations committed to healthy ecosystems, while also honoring the community's perspective, lived experience, and leadership. The act of composting ensures that food scraps and green waste is never wasted, but returned to enrich the soil. It sequesters carbon and helps to minimize greenhouse gas emissions from landfills. Furthermore, it also enriches the community, creating cooperative human networks, inclusive spaces, and green jobs. Our guest today illustrates how composting should and can be available to everyone, no matter if you live in an apartment or a single-family home. We explore how his organization has grown a successful urban composting model by developing spaces and collaborations with a wide variety of partners, including community, nonprofits, businesses, and city departments. LA Compost cultivates community through their extensive network of accessible compost hubs, including food scrap drop-off locations and urban composting sites. They have even set up infrastructure in Griffith Park, one of the largest urban parks in North America. Composting is an act of social justice, supporting food security and localized food systems. This in turn improves the environment by implementing restorative practices, which can mitigate negative health impacts and empower community. Thank you for tuning in to EcoJustice Radio and our show, Soulful to Soilful, Cultivating Community Through Urban Composting. I am your host, Jessica Aldridge, and it is my honor to welcome our guest, Michael Martinez, founder and executive director of LA Compost. Welcome to EcoJustice Radio. Welcome, Michael.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the time.
Oh, I appreciate you. Welcome back to EcoJustice Radio. You were one of my first guests.
Yeah, it's been a few years, so it's good to come full circle and, go through a whole ordeal with what's been happening. But yeah, it's great to be here.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to love this because I want to know what's been happening it's been 4 years since you were on the show. And that show was called Empowering Communities Through Urban Composting. You're still doing that, and you have expanded greatly. And I want to talk about what's happening and also how others can emulate the many urban farming programs that are out there. So I guess we should just start, for those that may not know, LA Compost is very active in Southern California. What is it that LA Compost does, and what are the services and the infrastructure that you offer?
Absolutely. Yeah. So our tagline has been and continues to be soil and people. We are community composters, and we really focus on both that first and second word equally. The community, the people we engage with, and of course, the composting, the benefits to healthy soils in our communities. We really work to restore lost connections to the soil and one another. So we work with a diverse, complex network of partners across LA County to really co-create spaces for compost access, restorative practices, and community empowerment. We really like to look at the whole picture and support this healthy transition where food is not seen as waste, but really returned to the soil for the next cycle of life. So we are community composters. We establish decentralized community compost infrastructure, schools, churches, museums, community gardens, art centers, housing project, anywhere where there's food, people, the ability to tell that full story of food. And we essentially come alongside communities to facilitate these dialogues, allow for knowledge share, and for compost and food scraps to stay within the very communities where that food was generated, consumed, or purchased. So yeah, we've been doing this for quite some time. Glad to be back after 4 years, and very excited to share kind of the growth, development, and excitement that we've been experiencing since our first time on the show.
I think it's going to be a really good show. You just said the word compost in regards to saying that wherever the compost and the food scraps lay, but we also sometimes call compost the organics waste, right? But then there's the stuff when it breaks down, it becomes compost. So explain, what is compost? What happens?
Yeah, so there's so many definitions out there in regards to what compost is. And there's a really technical terms in regards to like returning organic waste through a managed oxidative decomposition process. I'd like to say that really simply, compost is a noun and a verb. It's a noun in that it's the act of decomposing organic materials over time. And it's a verb in that it's the finished process or product of those organic materials that turns into a stable-like, rich, humus-like material. So it's not soil per se, it's a soil amendment. It's a probiotic for our soil. It's a nutrient-rich superfood for our soil. And essentially what's happening is raw feedstocks like our food scraps, like our coffee grounds, like our leaves, our mulch, our wood chips, are consumed by the bacteria and fungi and other beautiful microbial life that we can't see, really breaking that down. And essentially, as they break it down, they are allowing for the nutrients to be plant available and readily available for our plants when those roots are ready to uptake it. So it is a process. I like to use the analogy of like baking or cooking. You are gathering ingredients. You are creating certain environmental conditions for something to happen. And that's what you're doing when you're composting. You're gathering ingredients, whether it's backyard, community scale, large scale. You're creating the ideal conditions for the microbes to do their work. And they, in turn, establish this beautiful, rich, finished, like humus material that we all love in our edible gardens and green spaces.
And for these hubs that you have, these compost hubs where people come and can drop off their food scraps, what are the ingredients that they're allowed to drop off?
Yeah, it's very much, we like to use these hubs as teachable outdoor classrooms. So at a highly macro level response, we often respond with anything that is alive can be composted in the right conditions and environment. So because we are composting at the community scale, because we are composting in high residential schools, churches, we want to be mindful of the spaces that we're engaging with. So we, at our hubs, at the community hubs, we primarily take fruits and vegetable scraps. We take coffee grounds, eggshells. We take mulch, leaves, sawdust, newspapers. We kind of leave out the meats, bones, dairies, fats at our community scale hubs, primarily also because of the volume and the temperatures in which our smaller bins get to. We can take some of those materials at our regional hubs, which I'll talk about later, but it's nice to just kind of stick to the simple things that are going to break down and create a really pleasant experience for someone who's just getting into composting for the first time. It's typically broken into like these categories of browns and greens, materials rich in nitrogen, materials rich in carbon, but we also talk about bulk density and airflow and water retention and moisture. So we talk about the ingredients, we talk about how the community's engagement and level of investment is part of that process. But at our community-based hubs, very simple: fruits, vegetables, spent coffee grounds, dead flowers on occasion. But the learning is in the doing. You know, it's not a perfect mix. It's very much a process that changes over time. But our foundational items are pretty simple and straightforward to allow for a really pleasant first-time experience for most community members.
Nice. And we just had a show called about the truth about compostable foodware. Do you have people ask if you'll take 100% fiber-based items or bioplastic items?
Yeah, we get those questions a lot. And again, always allows for teachable moments in regards to the type of infrastructure that's required to break down certain materials. 100% fiber-based products can be accepted. We are trying to be mindful of products containing PFAs and just the awareness around that dialogue and conversation, which is like this forever chemical essentially. But yeah, we've seen the bamboo plates, the cutleries, the things of that nature that have really broken down. A lot of the bioplastics we do find in our piles on occasion, but we do remove them because they will stay intact for years. So we obviously preach the gospel of reusables. And if it is going to be a single use, unwaxed lined paper cup or plate is ideal for our piles as well, just in regards to its ability to decompose.
I don't even know if there's any cups out there that are truly unlined, really. So
you're right. It's probably just the little plates where you need like 6 of them to hold a slice of pizza or something.
Pretty much. If I could just say for our listeners, if you do want to know more about that, just check out The Truth About Compostable Foodware, one of our last episodes. So, Michael, what is meant by the term urban farming and also compost sheds?
Yeah, so urban farming, again, similar to the compost definition, there's many definitions out there, but essentially it's kind of the process of cultivating, processing, and distributing food in and around urban or high dense areas. So here in the Los Angeles area, urban farms exist in vacant lots in people's backyards and on side lots of Salvation Army property. It's really beautiful to see the complex diversity nature of urban farmers. Obviously, a lot of them are back front side yard farmers, a lot of school raised bed gardens, but essentially it's cultivating and distributing food within an urban area, which, in my opinion, the best urban farming is very inclusive of the community in which you are serving and working alongside of. So there are some incredible groups that are hiring the community, training youth, training community members who are the recipients of that food. And then when it comes to compost sheds, that's kind of like a relative new term that we're trying to establish, modeling after, of course, watersheds, where you kind of look at multiple collection points, perhaps whether that's farmers markets, schools, small businesses, community gardens, and how are those small collection points leading to perhaps a larger location for processing. So essentially looking at it through a lens of regionally based composting within the context of community scaled infrastructure. Yeah.
I love it. Well, the largest amount of material that ends up in our landfill, about 40%, is considered organics. Those putrescible things, the fruits and the veggies and the food scraps and the green waste, things that could technically be composted. And according to the EPA, wasted food makes up 24% of what ends up in our landfill. And this could be from the discards from a farm. It could be wasted food at the store or what people toss. And I asked this of our last guest, and I would like to ask this of you as well. Why is composting incredibly important for the environment and human health?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one that really requires us to think about where material goes. You hear the common term that there's no such thing as a way. Things just don't go and disappear. And it leaves our zip code, it leaves our neighborhood, it leaves our streets, but it is in fact going somewhere. It is in fact having an impact on the communities in which they call home, near where these infrastructures take place. So I think for us, when we look at human health and just health in general, we sometimes look at what happens to food scraps when they are mixed with regular items and break down in landfill or just sit in landfill. So when we compost in communities and when compost is done correctly, it's done aerobically. There's air present and aerobic microbes are able to break down the material. But when it is trapped in a landfill, it goes anaerobic, means without air. And what happens when food scraps reach landfills is essentially methane is created, which is a harmful greenhouse gas, which is contributing to this climate emergency that we're in. One of the things we like to reiterate is that there really is no such thing as waste. Food scraps are simply a part of a resource that we can reinvest in our communities. And when it turned into compost, the beautiful benefits of compost are incredible. From a water retention standpoint, obviously we're in a crazy drought here in California and other states. So how can we allow for our soils to serve as sponges to really retain water? A few times it does rain. How do our soils filter out 60 to 90% of stormwater pollutants? How do our soils store nutrients, prevent erosion, enhance plants' disease suppression, and even just serve as a carbon sink? The answer is compost. So soil health equates to human health, and I just really believe it's really important that we don't send our food scraps away to quote unquote disappear, but we see, we trace, and we ensure that they return to the very communities that they can serve and support the general and overall health.
Yes. And just as a reminder to our listeners that the methane that is created from the decomposition of organics in the landfill is the third largest source of human-related methane emissions. So it's not a small amount coming out of these landfills. Michael, writer Jessie Taylor Cruz, in an article that she wrote, says composting food waste is an act of resistance. How is the making and using of compost tied to social and environmental justice? And you kind of approached that already, but I would like to expand that conversation.
Yeah, I love that they said that. Jessie said that. I've attended a few of her talks and just really powerful individual. I believe that compost is tied to social and environmental justice in the sense that it really combats toxicity within environments, within neighborhoods. It gives us a glimpse into the power of collective action and response. We realize that transformation is not only needed from seeing waste as a future resource, but it also gives us this understanding that systems and structures that have harmed marginalized communities for many years can also be composted and transformed per se. It's a direct act of resistance to the current status quo of how the system currently functions. I think what's so beautiful about it, though, is it gives the individual the power to do something and to do it well, and to know that they are not alone or isolated in this act of resistance. They are now in the control of supporting their own soil health, perhaps growing their own food, contributing to their own health, as well as the health of the environment that they are a part of. So I love that term, composting as an act of resistance. And I just feel like the doing of compost, the creation of compost, has so many co-benefits to the individual user as well as the location where it's taking place.
And that's a good transition into the next question that I have for you. You know, LA Compost offers multiple ways for people to get involved. How do individual efforts have long-lasting compounding impacts? And the reason why I'm asking this is that it seems to be daunting sometimes to wonder if can my little small action really create change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we try to do is not just preach the gospel of compost, but give people the space, access, and opportunity to put what was learned into practice, to ensure that education is a strong form of action and response. But what I think really gets me excited is when we look at these mycorrhizal kingdoms or these soil food webs or these incredible interactions that are taking place below the ground in the soil, there's resource sharing, there's communications, there's resilience, there's strength in the numbers. And it's not one central hub. It's many millions of organisms connected and working towards something bigger than their individual selves. And to me, that is very inspirational in regards to what can happen and what can take place above the ground. Here in LA County, we're the most populous county in the country. Over 10 million of us call LA County home. So how do we mimic that mycorrhizal network, and how do we establish a human network where transfers of life take place, where we benefit one another, where we support one another, and we create the structures and systems that allow for life to thrive all across our region? And I think we see that when one individual drops off at a hub and sees 6 of their neighbors, or when 400 families drop off at a farmer's market within 2 hours, there's this sense of camaraderie, community, and part of something much bigger than my individual self, especially in a city as large and populated as Los Angeles.
Let's talk about that human network. Why is it so important to create these localized, community-based and born programs and solutions?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been doing for quite some time is hiring from the community, is leaning into the lived experience, perspectives, and leaderships of community organizations, because what better groups or people to lead these efforts than the people who call these spaces home, who've seen the changes and developments of these spaces. It establishes local jobs. There's innovation and creation that takes place at the community level. The very act and nature of compost in and of itself is very much inclusive of inviting various diverse ingredients to come together to transform into something that is life-giving and doesn't just celebrate itself, but gives itself away. So I very much believe that, when we talk about this modeling how we see the earth function, it's like when the trees drop their leaves to decompose close to the root zone, how are we establishing resources, infrastructure, and community-based programs at the very place in which people call home, and these programs should be offered? So it's complex, it's diverse, it's difficult, but it's so rewarding and worth it to see community members step up, to see their lived experience and perspective really lead innovative new programs and responding based on an ability to know, to participate and co-create programs through dialogue and knowledge sharing.
You had said to me in a previous conversation that compost is inclusive, not exclusive. Would love your take on that before we go to break.
Yeah, I feel like the beauty of a compost pile really comes from the collective imperfections and diversity of its ingredients. It's not as picky, right? It's like, ooh, I don't want that food scrap, or ooh, that leaf is not the right shape. It's very much like all are welcome, except if you're a bioplastic in the community compost pile, of course. But it's very reflective of the communities here in Los Angeles. I say the beauty of a pile are the diversity of ingredients, and the beauty of our city are the people who call it home. So there's this mirror-esque parallel that's taking place with our piles and the very people who are around those piles, turning, engaging, watering, and sifting. So it's very much an inclusive activity that is taking place across the country and world, and we hope it continues to grow.
And I think it will. We're going to take a break real quick, come back and speak with Michael Martinez, the founder and executive director of LA Compost. And I want to hear now about the different programs that are happening and how we can, how others might be able to emulate those throughout the state, throughout the country, throughout the world. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to Soulful to Soilful, Cultivating Community Through Urban Composting, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Michael Martinez, founder and executive director of LA Compost. Michael, we were talking about, before the break, about creating, human networks through compost. You also mentioned some of the programs that y'all are doing and also job opportunities. I want to touch upon the job opportunities for a second. You have something called the Composting Cultivator Workshop. And I also know that you are working with the LA Conservation Corps. Can you explain what this is?
Yeah, absolutely. So much of our work is on establishing strong user experiences, from volunteers to interns to potentially inevitable employees. So many of our current employees and staff actually came from our super volunteers who've stuck with us for so long. But our Compost Cultivator program was essentially an opportunity for these super volunteers to shadow our compost managers, to participate in a several-month-long kind of TA shadowing experience where they learned best management practices, were able to help facilitate workshops, work days, corporate events, really learn the ins and outs of community composting, building community compost infrastructure, and maintaining it. And at the conclusion of the program, they were to work on a final project that they would return back to their community, whether it was wheelchair accessible sifters and bins, whether it was a Discord channel for college students that were going off around the country to still stay engaged. It was really allowing these individuals to get the skill sets, get the knowledge and experience, and then return with that to the communities where they came from. They're still with us. We've hired a few of them from that program. And it was just an incredible opportunity for the volunteers who continue to show up to get a little bit of more love, attention, and investment. And then we have worked with LA Conservation Corps in the past, training them how to build the 3-bin systems. We are working on creating IKEA-like instructions so that we can outsource and give those instructions to anyone. But one of the things where we hope to work with LA Conservation Corps very soon is with our farmers market drop-off programs, as well as our park maintenance programs. LA Conservation Corps is an incredible nonprofit across the state of California. There's a chapter for every major region. And we hope that we are able to create a space to accept some of these graduates to work at the farmers markets, at the park locations, at the community hub levels, to show that that green jobs are in fact possible.
You just said a 3-bin system. I caught that. And in the waste world where I'm from, a 3-bin system's like your trash and recycling, and organics, but I think it's a little different, right?
Yeah, the community composting, the 3-bin, the way we describe it is it's easily a 3x9 or 4x12 box that has 3 chambers that allows for material to be deposited, material to kind of cook or heat up and break down, and then material to mature and cure and just kind of cool. So It's in reference to a community composting infrastructure that you'll see kind of across the country. But how are we empowering communities to reimagine the materials that we use to build them, to allow for innovation and creativity to enter the space? But yeah, not a typical sidewalk 3-bin system, more so community garden, community compost infrastructure 3-bin system. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, no problem. The other thing too, and I know we've alluded to it, and you and I know what this is, but I think we have listeners that are like, what's the farmers program that you keep mentioning? So what is can you just describe the farmer market drop off, what you're doing with farmers markets? Because what you're doing, that model, I think can be, and probably is being, duplicated in other cities across the country.
Absolutely. And by no means are we the original innovators of this. New York City's been doing this for quite some time. There are other major cities doing this, but essentially it really appeals to multifamily homes, people without space to compost on their own. And basically what we do is we set up shop at different farmers markets across the city. And we have staff that are sharing the importance of compost, the benefits of compost, educating on all things compost. And essentially what it allows is for residents to freeze their scraps throughout the week, weigh, deposit, and record their diversion metrics. We've even established an app and a QR code for them to weigh, snap a QR code, and it gives them actual real-time metrics of their participation of the program. We are currently at 7 markets across the city with the goal of expanding into 20 in the next few months. And it's really just great because each market is diverse, unique, and very much a reflection of the community in which it's located, from the vendors, those coming by, to the conversations that we have with community members talking about their lived experience and their connection to compost. So very cool program. What's even cooler is how close the material travels. So when it's collected at the farmers markets, it's taken within a 5-mile radius to a local park to be processed. And it's processed same day. So it's collected on a market where we work and engage with volunteers and community members. And that afternoon, there's a shift that engages with community members and volunteers to process it in real time. So, yeah.
And we're going to talk about that park program in a second. I first want to know about your soil farmer program.
The Soil Farmer program is actually a direct response to the quarantine mandates that came due to COVID and the global pandemic that we all have been experiencing. And we realized that quarantining is very different for many different individuals. It might be nice if you have ample space to walk freely, back, front, side, yard. A lot of people really enjoyed gardening and enjoying their green space, but for a lot of communities, that was not available or accessible to them. So the Soil Farmer program really recruited community residents within neighborhoods across South Central Los Angeles to support with climate and community resilience through direct and immediate land stewardship within the community green spaces. So this was parkways, front yards, driveways, really allowing for small composting and green space infrastructure to be built to create this human network that we're talking about on a block-to-block approach. It was coupled with a community cooperative hub nearby so that if they needed mulch, they can get mulch. If they needed seedlings or seeds, they can get that. If they needed anything from worms and vermicompost, anything to support and jumpstart their individual projects, they can receive that. And I think what was beautiful about this program is that the compost manager that was leading this program and that was running the co-op at the middle school was a former student at that very middle school and grew up in that neighborhood and knew the residents and neighbors by name. So it was a very family, community-esque program that established that mini human network in a 5-block radius. And it proved to work. We're seeing a whole lot more demand, excitement, and people talking of like, hey, how do I participate? So we're just really excited to respond to the needs of the community, but also let the community lead with what they need and what they want to see. And we were really just taken back with the goodness and the practices that people were already initiating, from recycling what they found on the street, growing plants in old buckets, trash cans, tires, and it was really incredible to see the complexity and diversity of green spaces with limited space overall, essentially.
Oh, I love it. I'd love to see those photos. Well, we talk about those spaces, right? Finding spaces where people may not think spaces exist to have garden, to create compost. And then there's the spaces that may be a little bit more easily or readily available, like schools and churches. But then, as you've alluded to, Y'all have been working with cities and their parks and recreation sanitation departments to set up locations within park infrastructure. Tell us about that and how might others seeking to do the same do that in their city?
Yeah, so working in partnership with park locations has been about a 4 to 5 year process. We were working at a regional park 4 years ago where we were composting with windrows, had vermicompost flow through worm bins, and it was really a proof of concept to show how do we reimagine the green spaces that exist in our city and county. And just to throw some numbers out, we have over 17,000 acres of city parkland, over 75,000 acres of county parkland. Obviously, not all of it is flat or usable, but it just gives you a little bit of perspective of the usable land that is actually out there. We took an ambitious route and decided to go for one of the largest urban parks across the country, one of the largest urban parks in our city, and that was Griffith Park. To put into perspective, Central Park in New York City is a little over 800 acres. Griffith Park is over 4,400 acres. It's its own city. It's massive. So it took 2 years to negotiate with advisory boards, commissioners, nonprofits, community advocates to really convince them that community composting within a park, within the park central area like Griffith would be beneficial. And it very much has. We've had so many workshops, so many work days, have diverted over 500,000 pounds of organics in less than 7 months. And it really has become the first of many dominoes to fall. We are working in all sorts of parks, not just parks with very large space, but also in community parks and community gardens, which are tied to parks. And the way we're working with cities is that LA Rec and Parks is providing the space and LA Sanitation is supporting with the farmers market program. So we are able to share more city programs, more city workshops, complementary program offerings that we provide, that LA City provides. So our sanitation department supports with the farmers market collection, and our recreation and park departments support with the space to actually process. So it's kind of like a match made in heaven because they don't typically work together or talk very well. So we are kind of that glue or bridge to allow for them to see a program that benefits all parties. And when the mayor came out with the Green New Deal, there was very much an initiative for food scrap drop-offs to be available at all farmers markets, for a compost master plan, which establishes community and regional infrastructure to take place. And the beautiful thing about all this is this can happen in any major city across the country. And it should be happening. And it should be collaborative with city agencies, mayor's office, municipal districts. And New York's has been doing it. Other major cities and municipalities have been doing it. And we're just hoping to catch up, but also create our own lane and how we go about doing it as well.
You mentioned a little while ago, people collecting the food scraps at home to then deliver where they need to go in order to be composted. But there are people who are hesitant, Michael. They're like, there's some fears. There's fears around smell. There's fears that it's too difficult. Can you demystify some of the barriers that exist to composting?
Yeah, I mean, there are some beautiful hierarchies in regards to I first want to say composting is on a spectrum, right? There's those that will do it on their own and have really robust systems in their backyard. There's those who have a city who picks it up for them. There's those who drop off, like in some of our areas. So I think it's always important for folks to choose the right method based on space, capacity, outputs, and just your own personal situation. In the case that you don't have the space, time, energy, or capacity to compost on your own and you want to drop off, one of the things we always like to recommend is freezing your food scraps. One of the things that does is kind of eliminates the fear of fruit flies, smells, and moldy food scraps by day 3, right? Freezing your food scraps kind of puts everything on pause. If you've ever placed a water bottle or a glass bottle in the freezer by accident, what happens is it explodes because cells expand in extreme cold temperature. Obviously, your fruits and vegetables aren't exploding, but cell walls are rupturing to the point of, hey, the microbes, once it gets time to compost, it's going to be a lot easier to actually get into that material. So one of the things that I always like to recommend is use your freezer, drop off more frequent than you can. Extra chopping and minimizing the actual volume of those food scraps will speed up decomposition if you're doing it in your backyard. But composting is very forgiving. I feel like I'll always preach that the learning is in the doing. And I feel like the reason why we as an organization get to teach so many workshops and lead so many work days is because we've made mistakes. And that's okay. It's not if you've ever cooked, you haven't perfected a recipe your first time. So perhaps you start dropping off, and then you're like, you know what's coming out of their compost is beautiful. I want that at home. And the idea is for some really beautiful user experiences to emerge so that more people perhaps compost on their own and lead more community-based efforts. But freezing, dropping off often, covering with some browns or sawdust or a carbon material to cover your food scraps if you're only dropping off once a week. There's a lot of things that you can do to eliminate the fears that most people have.
Baking soda for smell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is there an amount of material that you are legally allowed to haul or compost?
Yeah, so we operate under the community composting tier under CalRecycle. So that tier...
And CalRecycle is the state agency in California that oversees everything waste.
Absolutely. So every state is different. So I am speaking very much with the California hat on. So there are different tiers when it comes to composting. And we operate under the community compost tier, which allows us to have up to 100 yards of material on site at any given time. So it sounds like a lot, but when you think about a Griffith Park, it's about half a basketball court. It's not a large amount of space. And we operate under those tiers, those regulations, but that's for one site. So if we have 50, it actually is a significant amount of material when it's spread across a large county. So it is a big jump from a community to commercial. And if you're a community composter, a commercial tier is probably too large for any community scale, to be quite honest. One of the things we are discussing is, what does a park tier look like? What does a middle tier look like that really benefits everyone involved and perhaps could be in collaboration with local haulers as well? So, yeah.
And I think this rolls right into my next question for you. For people who are looking to set up programs like LA Compost and what you offer up, what are some of the considerations, the roadblocks, words of encouragement that you can share?
Yeah, I just really recommend you to check out what exists. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance, ILSR.org, has a Find a Community Composter map so that you can actually look in your state, in your city, to see if there's already movement, if there's already a group doing this work. I'd also encourage you to look at your food recovery agencies. Obviously, as much as I'll preach the gospel of compost, getting edible food to people who can still eat it is a higher priority of ours. So look to see what recovery agencies exist and if there's a need for community composting. Do your research on the exclusive franchise agreements, on the regulations in regards to the hauling agreements, so what you can and can't move and where you can actually compost. So very much do your pre-research. Don't just jump into it and buy a van and slap your logo. I feel like we've seen so many groups kind of take that approach, and rightfully so. They're excited. They're hoping to fill a gap, but there are parameters that you have to follow. And we've been in this game for quite some time, and we've been able to see the benefit of collaborations with the city that are writing these policies, future collaborations with these haulers to show mutual benefit and collaboration versus competition. So look at what exists, do your research. Don't just start from nothing expecting for it to thrive long term.
And do you believe that with these waste haulers, for people that might not be familiar with waste hauler, that's a waste company. They're coming and picking up your recycling, your trash, hopefully your organics. And these franchise agreements that you were talking about, those are the agreements that they have with the city that says we can only charge this much. And those franchise agreements usually say that someone else cannot come in and charge for the same service, definitely can't charge less than that service. Well, Michael, we're going to take a quick break here. Everyone stay tuned. I want to know if collaborative relationships can exist with these waste companies. And then I want to know, Michael, what inspires and excites you. So please stay tuned and we'll be right back. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to Soulful to Soilful, Cultivating Community Through Urban Composting, with host Jessica Aldridge and guest Michael Martinez, founder and executive director of LA Compost. So, Michael, before the break, we were talking about things that people who want to emulate, organizations that want to emulate what LA Compost is doing, what things they need to consider, maybe some roadblocks, some words of encouragement. And you had mentioned franchise agreements with the city. So the city and a waste hauler, as you said, or for people that might not be familiar with that word, a waste company, that company that has the trucks that come around and pick up the recycling, they pick up the landfill bound material, and usually they pick up the organics. And now hopefully we're going to see in California and across the country that eventually those organics will also include food scraps, that they have these agreements with the cities that say we are supposed to charge X amount of money. And in these agreements, they don't allow for other people to come in and say, well, we'll charge less than the person who has the contract with the city. So it says if you can't charge for these services, which is what LA Compost says is that, either people drop off or you provide the collection for free. Do you believe that there can exist a symbiotic, collaborative partnership between community compost programs and these for-profit waste haulers?
I very much do. I feel like it's an all hands on deck effort. And I feel like the areas in which community composters thrive are areas where perhaps larger for-profit haulers can improve and vice versa, where the haulers have the infrastructure, the capacity, and the human power to move much larger metrics and material. The community composters can never match that. So I feel like it's a matter of how do we play to each other's strengths? How do we collaborate? How do we really very clearly define what we're good at and how that our collective efforts can just make the region, make the programs and the communities we're serving that much better? I am really excited about what can happen here in Los Angeles. I feel like not so much with haulers, but with the city. I never imagined that the city would be so excited to partner with us. And now we are in weekly conversations, innovating, ideating new programs that they feel like can serve, even with these hauling agreements in place. So long story short, I absolutely believe there's room for collaboration, participation, and co-creation of new innovative offerings. And hopefully, if I'm on your show again in the future, we can talk about what those have looked like.
I'm looking forward to that. I know you and I have been talking about this, so I'm definitely on board and figuring out what that collaborative relationship looks like.
Absolutely.
What else should exist? I mean, we're talking about the city level, these partnerships with the city, but there's, what should exist and what else is happening at the government level, both city, state, or federal, to support urban composting?
Yeah. So over the past few years, we've actually seen an entire shift. What's always been focused on farms and larger scale offerings is now finally coming to the community composters. Here in California. As I mentioned earlier, CalRecycle, the state governing agency over all things recycling, is actually creating grant funds specifically to support groups and organizations like LA Compost across the entire state of California. At the federal level, the USDA has put out grants for city agencies and municipalities to work with nonprofit community-based groups for more community composting efforts. And we're really excited to partake in both of those opportunities, the CalRecycle grant, and we're going to be working with LA Sanitation on the community composting grant. And I just feel like funds are needed. Proof of concepts are key. We can present on PowerPoints and Canva for days, but to take a decision maker or someone in a position of power to see it in practice, to take a hauler or for-profit business to see it in practice, and for them to actually physically see how it fits in within their overall operations is key. So I'm really excited with what's coming out at the state level with USDA, with some other funding opportunities, because it's really showing that community composting isn't just a hobby, a fad, or a pilot project. It's very much integral to the larger puzzle that is food scrap diversion, soil health, community health, and reimagining these scraps as resources that are reinvested in our communities.
And I just want to say it's the oldest form of recycling.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So you were mentioning what is happening at federal USDA. Are there programs or organizations around the United States that you would like to highlight that are working in the urban composting space and, helping to support that growth at the federal and state levels?
Yeah, there's so many friends that we've really established over the past several years. And I feel like just thinking off the top of my head, the few that I would highlight and shout out are Common Ground Compost in New York City, doing some incredible work around food scrap diversion at the local level. Bennett Compost, I believe, out in Philadelphia. Rust Belt Riders in Cleveland. Our good friends here down south, Food to Soil in San Diego. We are part of more of a statewide organization called the California Alliance for Community Composters. So it's a collection of everyone doing this work across California. So shouting them out. We Radiate is out in New York, and they focus on new forms of technology for managing, maintaining, and monitoring compost health. Loop Closing in DC, and Compostable in LA, which is looking at alternative methods of composting in our city as well. So there's a whole lot more names to list. Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a great table of contents to check out more wonderful orgs and groups in your city. But those are just a few off the top of my head that I've interfaced with quite a while for the past few years.
What's the map again? The Find a Composter map?
Yeah, Find a Community Composter, ilsr.org, Find a Community Composter. And it's a very interactive map for you to kind of see what exists in and around your neighborhood.
I love it. Where is all of this compost that's going to be created, that is being created through your programs, through LA Compost programs? Where is it all going? And what can people do with the compost that they make at home? I guess that's two separate questions.
Yeah. So at the individual level, so everything we do with the soil farmer program or household, that obviously is theirs. At the community level, similarly, we don't touch that. That stays for that community hub at the garden, at the church, at the school. It's at our regional hubs that we have a little bit more flexibility in regards to where that material goes. So we split it into thirds. A third stays on site for that park or urban farm. A third we give away for free to those that request it or during special events. And then a third stays for LA Compost to use for our network of partners. If there's a certain build or new farm that's going to be established that's outside of that region that we want to support and donate to, we can. If there are special projects, whether it's carbon farming pilots or soil remediation, we like to have access to a little bit to use how we see fit as well. And in regards to your second question, how do you use it? A lot of people use it as a super mulch, a super top dressing to cover exposed soil. A lot of people take the little that they receive and make compost tea, which is a liquid form of compost, not for human consumption, but for your plants, your landscapes, and your new seedlings during your planting seasons. A lot of people mix it with their native soil for their raised beds. And a lot of people actually use it as an inoculant to start their own compost bin. A lot of our compost obviously is full of life, a ton of microbial activity. So it's almost like a sourdough starter per se for you to inoculate your home batch of compost. So depending on the program and depending on the location will determine where that compost goes. But for the most part, it just stays on site or is given away for free back to that community.
For people that might be wondering, as you'd said before, and I say that when I'm explaining to people what compost is, and I say it's not soil, it's like us taking vitamins. It's like we can't live on vitamins alone, but it makes us better. And so compost is not soil. Are people able, and I guess it probably depends on the type of compost, but are people able to put it in pots, or is that too strong?
They typically mix it with the topsoil. It's more just a soil amendment. We always reference it as like a probiotic or a top dressing of some sort. So yeah, we never recommend just people growing directly in the compost. We never recommend people growing directly in the compost. Of course, we've had people experiment with it, have some success, but we like to use it as a teachable moment as well. In regards to compost, it is a soil amendment. It is organic matter for the soil. Soil is very much that sand, clay, silt kind of ideal loamy soil that you're after, depending on what you're trying to grow. And of course, we always say that not all plants need compost. There's a lot of natives and specific drought tolerant plants here within the LA region that actually don't need it to thrive. They are conditioned and know very well how to grow and thrive in the low water conditions that we currently have in the LA area. So we are working with the city on creating a healthy soil survey and a soil report that actually looks at the areas within the city that compost can actually be applied. There's a lot of tree giveaways within Parks Department. A lot of them are fruit trees, so we can couple those giveaways with mulch and compost to really allow those trees to thrive as well.
So talking about how we use our compost and for how it can be a supplement to plants, but it's also a benefit to fire damage avoidance and ecosystem remediation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so when we experienced several of the fires over the past few years, we saw two kind of catastrophic events take place: a wildfire followed by a heavy rain on unstable soil. So the fires cleared out the brush and the trees and the shrubs. And then the immediate rains that followed created a lot of landslides and soil moving very far locations. So with compost, you are really helping with water retention and moisture retention. You are also supporting germination rates, but you're also adding the life of the compost back to that soil to create that structure that is needed to prevent erosion, to prevent the soil turning into just dust or dirt. So it's very much a multi-purpose benefit in regards to absorbing and holding water, allowing for new growth to take place, and securing and providing structure, porosity, and life to soils to ensure that erosion isn't just a sneeze or a rainfall away.
I like that. Just to remind everyone, where all can composting take place in an urban environment?
Yeah, I think compost then honestly can take place anywhere. I think of schools, I think of churches, I think of libraries, I think of art centers, apartment complexes, community gardens, farmers markets, parks, backyards, parking lots. It's really only limited to our imagination and where we can actually source the ingredients and be respectful of our neighbors, and obviously not compost on on-ramps of freeways, but like it really allows our creativity and co-creation to thrive. Here in Los Angeles, we created a survey that really talked about the potential of community composting. And we GIS mapped every school, every nursery, every church, every library. And it was just incredible to see the hundreds of dots kind of sprayed across the bird's eye macro view of the city of Los Angeles. And that's the case for every city across the country. Just looking at parks, just looking at schools, just looking at libraries, and even households who are kind of community leaders or liaisons within their block. So I truly believe it can happen nearly everywhere.
I could say that those off-ramps and the medians on our highways probably need some compost for sure.
Right.
Michael, what excites you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I get really excited when I think about the transformation that is taking place in green spaces, in communities, and how it is led by innovation of the people who call those spaces home. I am a father of two. I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and I very much think of these hot summers and our lack of rain and what we can do to respond to some of the impacts that we are facing with our climate emergency. I think I get excited when I work and coexist alongside community members to reimagine how things can function, how we can build systems that bring life to everything and everyone around it, and how we essentially just inoculate goodness. There's the ability to create joy and collaboration and just goodness in our neighborhoods. And the fact that we can do that with compost really excites and inspires me for sure.
In a personal conversation that you and I had, you described the nature of this work as soulful and soilful. I think this is a profoundly beautiful comment. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, as I mentioned when we first started the dialogue and conversation, our tagline is very much soil and people. We are community composters. It is as much the work of the soul and the human engagement as it is of the soil. And our friend Xavier over on the East Coast, I think, has an organization called Soulful City that is really looking at this intersection of the soil and the soul. And I have this kind of cheesy tagline that goes kind of, the only difference between the soil and soul are you and I. When you're composting with your neighbor, with community members, with people you have never met, there is this inevitable like spiritual calmness to it for sure. It's it's human heavy and it's soil heavy. And we're really just trying to mimic the beauty that's taking place below the ground, above the ground across our communities.
Well, Michael, we're going to extend this conversation on our Patreon. A few more questions for you. So listeners, if you want to get the extended version of this show, definitely become a member of our Patreon. But the last question for today, where can our listeners find more information on LA Compost, and how can they stay alert of any news in the urban composting world?
Yeah, so we have a website, lacompost.org. You can follow us on Instagram at lacompost, where we're updating throughout the week. On a more macro level, there's the U.S. Compost Council that has annual conferences and updates throughout the year. There's the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, as I've sung their praises throughout this conversation. And then if you're California specific, the California Alliance for Community Composting, the cacc.org is a really great resource just to see all the new emerging groups, programs, and offerings across the state of California.
Thank you, Michael. It has been wonderful to have you. Again, we're going to extend this conversation on our Patreon. Please join us there, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for being on the show today. I really appreciate you and everything that LA Compost is doing in the community.
Absolutely. Thank you for the space and time. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you to our guest, Michael Martinez, founder and executive director of LA Compost. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Soulful to Soilful, cultivating community through urban composting. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal 350, and Adventures in Waste. If you like what you heard and you want others to be informed, you know what to do. Subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a donation to the show. A project of SoCal 350, the show can be found on kpfk.org, kpft.org, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Created by Mark and JP Morris, executive producer Jack Ite, producer and co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.